It began on a morning when Paris was not yet awake, and the mist along the Seine had the thickness of unspilled milk. From the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres, Inspector Moreau watched a barge slide past like a ghost, its lanterns dim, its cargo hidden beneath tarpaulin folds. The city was stirring, but slowly, as if reluctant to face what the night had left behind. In the bureau behind him, the smell of yesterday's coffee mingled with the faint oil scent from the typewriter. That was when the telegram came, brief, unsigned, and curious in its phrasing. "He has returned. Yellow gloves, Montmartre." No name, no sender, no demand. Just a warning that carried the unease of a half-remembered sin. By noon, Moreau would find himself standing before the body of a stranger whose gloves, fine leather, butter yellow, had been removed, laid carefully upon the chest, as though the dead man had dressed himself for judgment. And by nightfall he would begin to suspect that this was not a new crime at all, but the echo of something unfinished, something the city had chosen to forget. Stories like this one are seldom written in police reports. They survive only in whispers in the faint smoke that lingers after a match is struck. If you wish to follow Inspector Moreau into the fog, through the cafes, the letters, and the lies that Paris keeps beneath its quiet surface, stay with us. Subscribe, share the case, and let the lamplight guide you deeper. What you are about to hear has never been told beyond these walls. The day began with fog that seemed unwilling to rise, a grey curtain drawn tight over the city's roofs and chimneys. From the window of his office at Quai des Orfèvres, Inspector Moreau could see the faint outline of Notre Dame through the mist, a shape without substance, as though it were remembering itself. The air smelled of coal and rain, the kind of weather that made even Paris feel like a secret. Moreau stood without moving, his hands resting behind his back, pipe unlit, eyes fixed on the drifting shapes of barges below. He had slept little, dreams had come restless, broken by the echo of a bell he could not place. The typewriter on the desk still bore the marks of last night's unfinished report. When the telegram arrived, it was delivered not by the usual clerk, but by a young boy in a cap too large for his head, dripping rainwater onto the floor. Moreau gave him a franc and watched him vanish down the hall before unfolding the message. 3 lines only, no signature. "He has returned. Yellow gloves, Montmartre." He read it twice, then once more for the weight of its rhythm. It carried no urgency, no address, yet it pulsed with something private. The cadence of someone who knew exactly which words would disturb him most. He lit his pipe, drew a slow breath, and turned toward the bureau where Janvier sat sorting arrest reports. "Montmartre," he said simply, and the younger man looked up, puzzled. Within Sapu, the hour they were in, a black Citroën rattling its way through the narrow streets, tires hissing over the damp cobblestones. The lamps were still burning in some windows. Paris had not fully woken. Children in scarves hurried to school, a baker opened his shutters, and a woman in a red shawl swept her doorstep without looking up. The hotel stood on the corner of Rue des Martyrs, one of those narrow, peeling establishments where strangers come and go without leaving names. A concierge in a wool cardigan led them up a crooked staircase to a door at the end of the hall. The corridor smelled faintly of varnish and soap, but underneath lingered another scent, the unmistakable sweetness of cologne, the kind that stays even when its owner has gone. The room was small, almost bare, a single bed, an iron washstand, a window that looked onto a grey courtyard where laundry hung stiff in the cold. On the bed lay the man, mid-40s perhaps, well-groomed, though his shoes had been wiped clean too deliberately. His eyes were closed, his features calm, almost arranged. Across his chest, as though placed with care, rested a pair of yellow leather gloves. Butter-soft, immaculate, no weapon, no sign of struggle, just stillness. Moreau stepped closer. The lamp on the table flickered with the faint draught from the window. Beside it lay a torn envelope addressed to Mademoiselle Adrienne Duhamel, Rue Colincourt. The postmark was faded, 1919. Moreau turned it gently, as if afraid the paper might crumble. Inside, no letter, only a pressed violet, brittle and grey. "Heart failure?" Janvier murmured, though he knew better. Moreau shook his head. "Not quite. Look at the nails. Faint blue. The pupils are constricted. Something taken. Quietly, in measured dose." He leaned closer, noting the line at the collar, the faint shadow of a wedding ring once worn and removed long ago. But the gloves. Someone placed them after. The doctor confirmed it an hour later, his voice echoing against the tiled walls of the small room. Morphine, likely. Enough to silence the heart without pain. Suicide, perhaps. But Moreau had seen too many suicides that arranged themselves less neatly. Outside, the street had awakened. Children shouted, a tram clanged past, and somewhere nearby a musician played the accordion with tired joy. Moreau stood beneath the awning, pipe smoke curling around his head, watching the thin rain slide down his coat. A story was waiting inside that room. But whose story? The telegram had spoken as though this were a return, not a discovery. He has returned. At the local commissariat, the night register held a single entry that caught Moreau's attention. 2 nights earlier, a man matching the stranger's description had been seen at Café des Amis, corner of Rue Le Pic, arguing with the owner over a telephone call that never went through. The time, 11:30. The report, dismissed. Moreau folded the note into his pocket. Visited the café that same afternoon. The warmth hit him first, the smell of beer, onions, and old wood polished by years of elbows. Madame Vautrin, the proprietress, was a large woman with eyes too sharp to miss much. She remembered the man at once. "Elegant, polite," she said. Ordered only a coffee, sat near the stove. Waited for someone, I think. Looked at the door every few minutes. When the telephone failed, he left angry, muttering something about fate. Moreau asked if he'd been alone. She hesitated. A girl came in half an hour before he left. Young, blonde, wearing a brown coat. She saw him but turned away. He didn't notice her. The inspector felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The quiet thread that tells a man he's not chasing a stranger, but a shadow of something unfinished. Back at the station, Lucas brought in the contents of the dead man's pockets. A handkerchief with initials ED, a railway ticket from Rouen to Paris, a small key tied with a faded blue ribbon, and 30 francs in notes. No identification, no watch. Whoever he was, he had been careful to erase himself. The morgue clerk later mentioned an oddity. The gloves, though fine, bore the faint scent of tobacco. Pipe tobacco, not cigarettes. And the size was slightly too small for the deceased's hands. They had not been worn recently. They had been chosen, displayed. A message, perhaps. As dusk fell, Moreau returned once more to the hotel room. The lamp had been extinguished, and the air was cold. He stood alone beside the bed, studying the shape of the body under the sheet. Outside, the fog thickened again, swallowing the city in its pale shroud. Somewhere below, a carriage wheel splashed through a puddle. He imagined the stranger arriving, raincoat buttoned, gloves in pocket, heart heavy with something that had waited too long. A man from Rouen, perhaps, returning to settle an account that could no longer be balanced. The telegram had said, "He has returned." Returned from where? From guilt? From exile? From the grave of someone who refused to stay buried? A knock at the door startled him. It was Janvier, holding a telegram slip. "Came just now," he said. Moreau took it, unfolding with care, the same uneven type, the same phrasing. "You are late." The gloves were never his. He looked up sharply. Who delivered this? Janvier shook his head. No messenger. It was found in the in tray downstairs. No one saw who left it. Moreau folded the paper slowly, feeling its weight. The fog outside pressed against the window like a living thing. The stranger in the yellow gloves had not come to die. He had come to remind someone of a debt. And whoever had sent the telegrams knew far more than they should. That night, Moreau could not sleep. He sat by the fire in his small flat on Rue des Écoles, the glow of the coals reflecting in his eyes. Madame Moreau slept in the next room, her breathing soft and steady. He poured himself a small glass of cognac, tracing the rim with his finger. The words replayed in his mind like a refrain. He has returned. The gloves were never his. The city outside was silent now, wrapped in its mist. But beneath that silence Moreau felt it, the hum of an old story stirring again, one whose end had been written too hastily. He knew then that this was no ordinary case. It was a memory dressed as a crime. And somewhere in the fog, someone was waiting for him to remember. The rain had turned thin and persistent, the kind that soaks through collars and creeps beneath cuffs. By the time Inspector Moreau reached Rue des Martyrs again, the day had dimmed into a tired shade of grey. Paris, beneath its umbrella of clouds, seemed half asleep. Shopkeepers closing early, the clatter of dishes echoing from narrow kitchens. The city was beginning its slow retreat into evening. He paused before the cafe's window, where condensation blurred the glow within. Through the fogged glass he could just make out the silhouettes of two men playing cards and the stout figure of Madame Vautrin moving behind the counter. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. Warmth greeted him like an embrace, the thick aroma of coffee, tobacco, and damp wool. Somewhere a radio murmured a waltz, low and uncertain. Madame Vautrin looked up at once. "Inspector," she said, recognition in her tone rather than surprise. "I wondered when you'd return." Her voice carried that particular blend of weariness and defiance found only in women who had seen too much and forgotten nothing. She wiped her hands on her apron and nodded toward the small table near the stove. That's where he sat, always the same chair. Moreau removed his hat and gloves, hanging them carefully by the door. "How many times?" he asked. "3 nights in a row, perhaps 4, she said. He'd come just after 10, order a coffee, sometimes a glass of cognac, never spoke to anyone. He'd sit there, staring at the door, like a man waiting for an apology that never arrived. The inspector studied the table, its scratched surface, the ring of a cup still faintly visible beneath the lamplight. "Did anyone join him?" "Not once," she replied. "Though there was that girl, as I told you, blonde, quiet, kept her hat on indoors, which tells you something already." She paused, glancing toward the back room. "She used to come here years ago before the war. Came with a man I didn't know well, though I remember his voice. Rough, impatient, like someone always about to leave." Moreau's pipe hung unlit between his fingers. "And you think she recognized him? The one in the yellow gloves?" "I think she was afraid too," Madame Vautrin said. "You can tell when a woman's heart stumbles." She froze the moment she saw him. Didn't even remove her coat. Sat 2 tables away, pretended to read a newspaper that had no pages left inside. When she left, she didn't look back, but her hand trembled when she paid. Outside, a tram rattled past, its light briefly flashing across the window pane like a memory. Moreau turned slightly, watching the reflection of the street fade. "What did he say, this man? Anything at all?" Madame Vautrin thought for a moment. "He asked once if we still received telegrams here. The public kind, you know. When I told him no, he smiled a little. Sad, as though it proved something he already feared. Then he asked for a match, though he didn't smoke. I gave him one anyway." The inspector's eyes drifted toward the counter. A small box of wooden matches rested there, stamped with the logo of a hotel in Rouen, Hôtel du Pont. He reached for one, turning it over between thumb and forefinger. "Did he leave these behind?" "He did," she said. "Left them on purpose, I think. When I called after him, he only waved his hand. Polite, like a man who'd said all he needed to say." Moreau placed the matchbox carefully into his pocket. "You're certain he didn't meet anyone here? No letters? No messages?" Madame Vautrin hesitated, her expression darkening. "There was something. The morning after his last visit, I found an envelope beneath the table. No name, no seal, just a single word on the front. Forgive. The ink had run from the damp. I threw it away. I wish now I hadn't." Moreau exhaled through his nose, a soft sigh that might have been the beginning of a thought. He thanked her, left a few coins on the counter, and stepped back into the rain. The street was quieter now. The fog had grown thicker, blurring the gas lamps into halos. He walked without hurry, his coat collar turned up, the faint rhythm of the city pulsing through puddles and footsteps. Each sound carried meaning. A door closing, a carriage wheel against stone, the whisper of a match struck somewhere unseen. As he turned the corner toward Rue Lepic, a man stepped out from the shadow of a doorway, short, hat pulled low, his face half hidden by the brim. "Inspector Moreau," he said, voice roughened by tobacco. "Yes." The man glanced around before speaking. "I was at the station the night he arrived. The man you're looking for. He asked me about the trains, said he'd missed one, but the last train had come in hours before." Moreau's eyes narrowed. "You're certain?" "As certain as I am of this rain," the man said. He looked lost. Not the way tourists are lost, more like a man who'd been gone too long. When I told him the time, he laughed, not out of humor but relief. Then he asked where one might buy flowers at that hour. "Flowers?" "Violets," the man said. "Only violets." A carriage passed, and by the time Moreau looked back, the man had already melted into the fog, leaving behind only the echo of his words. That night, the inspector returned once more to his office. The corridors of the Quai des Orfèvres were almost empty, the hum of the city replaced by the ticking of a wall clock. He spread his notes across the desk, the telegram, the envelope, the matchbox, the pressed violet. Each fragment seemed to hum with a faint connection, as though the air itself were trying to speak. The case had taken on a rhythm now, an invisible current pulling him forward. A dead man with gloves that were not his, a telegram from no sender, a cafe where time had folded back upon itself. And now, violets, the same flower that had fallen from the envelope in Montmartre. Moreau leaned back in his chair, watching the smoke from his pipe curl toward the ceiling. He thought of the woman Madame Vautrin had described, the tremor in her hand, the fear behind her stillness. There were ghosts that never stopped returning, he knew, and some wore faces the living could not bear to see again. In the drawer of his desk lay an old case file, dated 1919. He opened it without knowing why. Inside, a photograph of a young woman with clear eyes and a faint smile, Adrienne Duhamel, the name on the envelope. She had disappeared in the spring of that year. No trace, no body, only rumor. Her fiancé, a clerk from Rouen, had been questioned once, then released. His name, Émile Durand. Moreau froze. The initials on the handkerchief, E.D. He rose abruptly, papers scattering. The dead man had not erased himself. He had returned under his own shadow. And the telegram's message now rang, clear as confession. He has returned. He walked to the window. The Seine below was dark, its surface trembling under the rain. Somewhere out there, someone had known Émile Durand would come back. Someone had waited to see how long it would take him to die. As the clock struck midnight, Moreau turned down the lamp, leaving the office in half-light. The case had moved from silence to memory, from the living to the dead, and he could feel it now, the faint gravity of something inevitable pulling closer. In the distance, a barge whistle sounded on the river. and in its echo, Inspector Moreau thought he heard a woman's voice, soft, uncertain, like the beginning of a confession that would not yet be spoken. At dawn, the rain relented, leaving the streets rinsed and colourless, as if the city had been scrubbed of all its alibis. Inspector Moreau arrived at Gare du Nord before the commuters had fully thickened into their daily tide. In that hour, the station seemed both grand and vulnerable, its glass roof beading with leftover mist, its iron ribs panting out a breath that tasted of steam and hot metal. The porters moved like men in a dream, their caps askew, their hands red from cold. A boy pushed a trolley stacked with crates of onions, and somewhere a kettle hissed with the impatience of a creature that wanted to sing. Moreau stood under the great clock and watched the platforms brighten by degrees. He did not know why he expected to find an answer here, only that stations were books in which a man's life could be read if one placed a finger on the right line. He showed the photograph of the dead man, not a photograph precisely, but the careful sketch Janvier had made from the morgue, to the first porter he met. The man squinted, rubbed his ear, and shook his head. The second porter looked longer, then said, "That coat, I remember the coat." He pointed toward a narrow office where ticket clerks warmed themselves around a brazier. "Ask Mademoiselle Hélène. She notices everything." Mademoiselle Hélène was small, neat, and exacting, with a pin through her collar and hands that never seemed to stop arranging the world into obedience. She studied the sketch with a methodical calm that made Moreau like her at once. "3 days ago," she said, "the evening train from Rouen. He arrived alone, first class, though he did not carry himself like men who are accustomed to that carriage. He asked for the time, twice, and when I told him, he laughed without smiling. Then he bought a return for the following afternoon, and changed his mind before I had even written it down." "Did he speak of flowers?" Moreau asked. Her eyes flicked up, surprised. "Violets?" "Yes. He wanted to know if there was a florist open nearby. I told him there would be one on Boulevard de Magenta. He thanked me with a care I do not often see." She paused, searching her memory for the place where details lodge. "And his gloves? Yellow? The old calfskin kind?" "He took them off when he counted his money and laid them on the counter, as if afraid of soiling them, though they were perfectly clean." "Did he meet anyone?" "No," she said, and then, after a moment, "unless you count the way he recognized the station. Men who are lost look up at the signs." He looked at the tiles, the roof, as if measuring the distance between then and now. Moreau noted her words with the quiet satisfaction of a man who felt the pattern taking shape. He thanked her and crossed to the station-master's office, where a ledger of arrivals lay open like a confession. The hand that had written the list for that evening was precise, a clerk's pride evident in its neatness. The name of the man from Rouen was not there, of course not, but there was a notation in the margin beside the platform number. "Gentleman in brown coat asked for telegram office, directed to Boulevard de Magenta." The inspector traced the words with his finger. "A station is a sieve for the living. Everything that passes leaves a grain behind." He followed that grain into the streets, where the day had brightened to a pale and indifferent blue. The florist on Boulevard de Magenta remembered the gentleman who had come late, just before closing, soaked through and insistent. "Violets," she said, "and nothing else would suit. I told him March is too early, but we had a small basket, grown under glass." He smelled them, as if testing whether memory still had a scent, and he bought them all. He asked for paper that would keep them dry. "Did he say for whom?" "For a woman who had waited too long," she said, and smiled in apology for the poetry of it. "Those were his exact words, Inspector. I don't know what they mean. Sometimes people speak to flowers because flowers do not quarrel." In mid-morning, with the station's rhythm now beating within him, Moreau took the first train to Rouen. He travelled second class, preferring the company of people who looked out the window as if the world were something one could still observe without being seen. The countryside unrolled in hushed browns and greens, wet fields glistening, a farmhouse smoking gently into the washed air. He lit his pipe and thought of 1919, the envelope postmarked that year, its pressed violet a fragile blueprint of a feeling that had survived beyond its architecture. Men who loved in 1919 had learned to ration their words the way they rationed sugar. How long could a vow remain standing when every street corner still smelled of uniforms and farewells? Rouen received him with the patient face of a provincial city accustomed to minding its own sorrow. The station was smaller than Paris's, but it held the same music. Wheels moaning, voices bargaining, the sigh of steam. Moreau stepped onto the platform and breathed the river Seine in its other voice, wider here, looser, holding in its flow a memory of the sea. He walked to Hôtel Dupont because the matchbox in his pocket had already drawn the line between Paris and this place. The hotel stood near the bridge it was named for, a stone building with curtains that had yellowed with dignity rather than neglect. The concierge was a man whose hair had decided to be white before the rest of him had consented to age. He kept his ledgers with the reverence of a parish priest. When Moreau showed him the sketch, he did not need to look twice. "Monsieur Durand," he said. "Émile. He stayed with us 2 nights, always in room 7. He asked for the river view and kept the window open even when it rained, as if he wanted to learn the sound of the water again. So the name had come home." Moreau kept his voice even. "He used his name at the desk?" "On the 2nd night," the concierge said. "The first evening he wrote only a flourish, like a boy pretending adulthood. But on the 2nd night he waited until I had dipped the pen and then said very clearly, 'Durand, it is time.'" "Did he receive visitors?" "None that came past me," the man replied. "But the post brought him a letter in a plain envelope. He did not open it at the desk. He took it upstairs like a man later than his appointment." The concierge hesitated, then added in a softer tone, "He asked me where a man might buy violets that are not too proud of themselves. I told him the church market by the cathedral. He returned with empty hands." Moreau climbed to room 7 with the concierge's key and the courtesy of a guest who knows he is being allowed a sacrament. The room was unremarkable, a bed with a well-behaved quilt, a washstand with a basin that had not yet learned to chip, a narrow wardrobe with a mirror that made a man look thinner than his conscience believed him to be. He opened the wardrobe and smelled the faint ghost of a coat that had been dried before a fire. In the drawer of the bedside table he found a folded scrap of paper, the sort of thing the hotel maid might have missed because kindness had instructed her not to pry. It was not a letter, but an invoice from a small shop on Rue Saint-Romain, Maison Lefebvre, Gantier, for a pair of women's gloves, size 6, color jaune pale. The date was last week. The line for the purchaser's name had been left blank. Someone had paid in cash. Moreau turned the paper over and saw, on the back, a short penciled note written in an unsteady hand. Not hers, never hers. Try again. The inspector sat on the edge of the bed and let the room speak. A man arrives after years away, orders violets and purchases gloves too small for his own hands, a woman's gloves, and sleeps with the window open to let the river say what he can not. He receives a letter he does not open at once. He writes a note for himself, like a man rehearsing a confession. And then he buys a ticket back to Paris, where a hotel room in Montmartre waits for him like a stage set with its one necessary prop. At Maison Lefebvre, the glove-maker's wife recognized the description of Durand at once. "He brought a photograph," she said. "A lady in a hat with a veil, the kind nobody wears anymore unless she is late to a wedding. He asked for gloves to match the ones she wore in the picture. We had nothing exactly the same. He chose yellow because he believed she would forgive him for the color." She spoke gently, the way people speak when they are afraid their words might break what they describe. He did not know her size, he guessed. He guessed too small. Did he mention her name? She shook her head. Only that she had once smelled of violets and coal smoke. Her eyes softened, remembering something private. He left his address as Hôtel Dupont and said he would return if the gloves were wrong. He did not return. Moreau walked from the shop toward the cathedral, letting the street draw him as a compass draws iron. In the square, a few stalls still offered winter vegetables and dull roses made dignified by their stubbornness. A boy sold newspapers with yesterday's truth for half price. A woman sat beneath a wool shawl, her table covered with small posies of violets, their purple deep enough to trick the light. The inspector bought one and placed it in his pocket, as if he were placing it inside the past. He spent an hour with the parish records at Saint-Maclou, where a young priest with ink-stained fingers allowed him to page through baptisms and funerals as if memory were a liturgy. There was no Adrienne Duhamel there, not by that name, but there was a Duhamel family listed in a ledger of births from 1896, a tailor and his wife who had moved to Paris in 1912. The priest apologized for the imprecision of history. "We trade people like coins between the city and the provinces," he said. "Sometimes the coins return with different heads." In the late afternoon, a drizzle resumed, too light to be tiresome, more like the sky's way of remembering its place. Moreau climbed the hill behind the station where the old houses leaned together as if whispering. From there he could see the river bend, the bridge arching over its green-grey muscle, and beyond, a mill whose wheel had not turned in years. He thought of Durand standing somewhere along this view, measuring the distance from youth to regret. There are men whose love distills over years into something hard and transparent. There are others whose love ferments and sours until it eats the cask that holds it. Which had Durand become? Back at the hotel, the concierge produced the guest register as if offering up a relic. The first signature, the flourish, could have been anyone. The second was firm, unashamed, Émile Durand. Beside it, in a different hand, a notation in pencil, message left at desk. Moreau looked up sharply. "Who wrote this?" "I did," the concierge said. "A young man, a messenger from the post office, not in uniform, delivered an envelope the morning Monsieur Durand departed. It had no stamp. I placed it under the bell and went to fetch him. When we returned, the envelope had vanished." "Vanished!" The concierge lifted his hands, palms open. "The lobby was empty. Perhaps the wind, perhaps I am an old man who misremembers, but I know what I felt. The paper had weight." Moreau closed the ledger and thanked him. Outside, evening had begun to gather its tall shadows. He walked to the telegraph office and stood in line behind a farmer sending a money order and a girl with red hands writing to a brother in Le Havre. When his turn came, he wired Janvier in Paris, confirm personal effects of Durand. Search for letters delivered without stamp to cafes near Rue Lepic. Note any messenger boys known to frequent stations. He paused and added, almost without intending it, "Watch in tray. The hand that meddles is close." He took the night train back to Paris, a compartment lamp swaying gently like a heartbeat. The countryside slipped past with that exhausted grace only winter landscapes possess, and at each halt, tiny platforms with names that sounded like remembered lullabies, a few figures climbed aboard, carrying baskets and shawls and the burdens that do not fit into luggage. Moreau rested his head against the glass and listened to the train talk to the rails. Somewhere in the rhythm he heard the words from the concierge, message left at desk. Somewhere else, the glove-maker's wife. He guessed too small. And beneath both, steady as the turning of the wheels, the first telegram's certainty. He has returned. Near midnight, the compartment door slid open and a ticket inspector stepped in, his lantern painting the world in yellow. He stamped Moreau's ticket, then hesitated. "If you are the inspector from Paris," he said in a tone that made it sound less like a question than a duty. There was a gentleman on the earlier train. Your man, I think. He spoke to me as if we had known each other once. Asked whether the river looks different at night. What did you answer? That rivers do not change. Only the men who come back to look at them, the man said, and tipped his cap with the gravity of someone who had said it for himself as much as for another. When Moreau finally stepped once more onto the platform at Gare du Nord, the station's great clock had stolen minutes from him as thieves steal from men who believe one watch is like another. He crossed the hall where Mademoiselle Hélène was now gone and paused at the place where Durand had laid his gloves on the counter like a proof. The air smelled of cinders and rain. In that smell the inspector felt the city resuming its old bargain. Forget enough, and you will be permitted to go on. Remember too much, and the night will follow you home. He walked out into Paris as the lamps thinned toward dawn. Somewhere a newspaper press thumped, somewhere a milk cart rattled, and somewhere in Montmartre a window opened to let out the breath of a café that had kept its secrets too long. In his pocket the violet bruised against his hand, its scent altering with the warmth of his skin. He thought of room 7 at Hôtel Dupont, the invoice for yellow gloves, the note that insisted they were not hers, never hers. He thought of the envelope that had existed and then not existed, and of the invisible hand that was arranging the scene with the patience of an old grievance. By the time he reached the Quai des Orfèvres, the river had grown pale under the first rumour of morning. In his office, the in-tray waited with its ordinary hunger. Moreau lifted the top sheet of paper and found beneath it a new telegram, the same peppery type, the same cool voice refusing the warmth of a signature. Paris was never the stage. Look beneath the bridge where promises rot. He stood very still, listening to his own pulse, and realized that someone had begun to walk beside him inside the case, not an accomplice, not an enemy, something more relentless, a witness who wanted to be heard without being seen. He folded the telegram and slipped it into his notebook. The window clouded as the room warmed, and in the blur he caught his reflection looking back. It seemed older than he felt. He turned away before it could accuse him of knowing what he already feared to be true, that the distance between a man's return and his ruin is measured not in miles, but in the number of times he whispers a name in the dark and finds the dark answering. The morning brought no sun, only a dim, reluctant light that painted the Seine the colour of tarnished silver. Inspector Moreau sat at his desk, the fresh telegram still lying beside his notebook like a second pulse. He had not gone home that night. Sleep had become an old habit he no longer trusted. The office smelled faintly of ink and pipe smoke, and from somewhere down the hall came the hollow clatter of a typewriter. The world, it seemed, continued to write itself, indifferent to who read the words. At 9:30, Janvier entered, carrying a brown paper parcel, damp at the corners from rain. "This was left at the front desk," he said. "No sender, addressed to you directly." The handwriting was tidy but unfamiliar, the kind used by clerks who wish their words to leave no emotion behind. Moreau untied the string with care. Inside lay a stack of letters bound together by a blue ribbon, their paper yellowed, their edges curled inward like petals retreating from light. A faint scent rose as he opened the first. Not perfume exactly, but something older, a trace of pressed violets and smoke. The letters were all addressed to Émile, written in a woman's hand, both elegant and uncertain. The earliest dated back to 1917, the last from the spring of 1919. The handwriting was steady at first, then trembled with time, as if the ink itself had begun to doubt the future it described. Moreau read in silence, leaning forward, the lamp drawing a circle of gold around his hands. "My dearest Émile," the first letter began, "the trains are full of uniforms again, and the city smells of dust and waiting. Mother says I should not write to you, that it is improper when no engagement was announced. But what does propriety matter when one's heart is already on the train platform? I keep a handkerchief in my sleeve, though I never need it. I suppose I want to be ready in case you return before I know how to look at you again. The next was shorter, dated 6 months later. They have moved the factory to Rouen. I will follow soon, though I dread the river there. It seems to carry the weight of all our unspoken words. Promise me, if you tire of this correspondence, you will not vanish silently. Write at least once more, so that I may learn how to stop imagining. Moreau turned the pages one after another, the letters forming a pattern both tender and ruinous. He could almost hear her voice, the kind of voice that lingers on certain syllables, as if unsure whether to hope or to hide. She wrote of evenings at the cafe where the lamps hummed with flies, of violets bought too early in the season, of a coat mended twice because she could not afford to replace it. She wrote of patience, of faith in a promise never spoken aloud, and finally, in the last letter, she wrote of surrender. It has been a year, Emile. The factory closed, the violets have withered. I have heard nothing since your last telegram, the one that said only soon. I have learned that soon can last a lifetime. If you ever return, I will not be waiting. But know this, I forgave you long before you asked. There are debts that cannot be paid in money or sorrow, only in remembering. The signature was a single name, Adrienne. Moreau set the letter down, his hand trembling just slightly. For a long moment he stared at the ribbon that held them together. The blue faded to the colour of forgotten sky. Who had sent them? The parcel bore no return mark, no trace of handling except for a faint smear of ink on the wrapping paper, as though someone had touched it with wet fingers before leaving it behind. Where was it found? He asked quietly. Janvier shrugged. At the concierge's desk downstairs. The boy who brought it said only that a gentleman left it. Tall, hat pulled low, didn't give a name. Said he'd been sent by a lady from Rouen. He vanished before anyone could ask more. Rouen again? The circle tightened. Moreau reread the last letter slowly, tracing the words with his thumb. Forgiveness. The word appeared 3 times in the collection, always in the same hesitant stroke, as though the writer had meant to erase it, but lacked the courage. The pressed violet from the Montmartre envelope had the same tone of regret, a colour that once held fragrance and now only memory. He rose from his desk, walked to the window, and watched the river move beneath the bridge. Somewhere in that current lay the echo of her words, carried forward in silt and silence. If you ever return? He thought of the dead man's careful arrangement. Gloves folded on his chest, eyes closed as if in prayer. It was not the gesture of guilt. It was the gesture of someone answering a question that had waited too long. In the afternoon, Moreau took the letters to the archives, where the air smelled of dust and glue, and the past sat in boxes too heavy for one man to lift. The archivist, a pale fellow with spectacles like round mirrors, looked through the first page and raised an eyebrow. Private correspondence, he murmured, yet familiar. We catalogued a case in 1919, a missing person, female, named Duhamel. I remember it because the report vanished before trial. Vanished? Withdrawn, I should say, the man corrected himself. The chief inspector at the time, Lefebvre, declared it closed, no explanation. The file number was 304B. You'll find nothing in the drawer. It was removed from record. Moreau's jaw tightened. Lefebvre. A man whose portrait still hung in the hallway, smiling as if the city's secrets had been his to own. He thanked the archivist, though the words felt hollow, and returned to his office. The letters lay open again before him, their ink shimmering faintly under the lamplight. He felt, rather than reasoned, that these had been taken from the original case file. Someone had hidden them for decades, only to return them now. To him. That night, the city fell into rain again. From his window, Moreau could see the reflection of the street lamps trembling on the cobblestones, the light rippling like liquid confession. He poured a measure of cognac and read the letters once more, not as evidence, but as a man listening to two ghosts speak across years. He heard Adrienne's voice fading into silence and Émile's reply that never came. He imagined their paths diverging, one toward Rouen, one toward oblivion, until the years folded them into a single tragedy. A man returning to die not from poison, but from memory. The clock struck 10. The sound carried him back to the day before, to Madame Vautrin's café, to the smell of coffee and rain, to the envelope she had thrown away with the word "forgive" written on it. The same hand had written these letters. He was certain of it now. But who had kept them? And who had waited half a lifetime to deliver them into his hands? A knock at the door broke the silence. Janvier stood there, hesitant. "There's someone here to see you," he said. "A woman. Says it's about the Montmartre case." "Name?" "She won't give one, but she said this." He held up a small object wrapped in tissue paper. "Said you'd recognize it?" Moreau unfolded the paper slowly. Inside lay a single yellow glove, small, delicate, and perfectly matched to the pair found on the dead man's chest. Only this one bore a faint brown stain at the edge of the cuff. Not blood, more like ink, blurred as if by tears. "Where is she?" Moreau asked, rising. "In the lobby, near the radiator." He walked down the hall, each step echoing in the emptiness. The woman stood as though she had been waiting for him all her life. Slender, pale, dressed in a dark coat that seemed too heavy for her frame. Her hands were gloveless. Her eyes, though tired, held an unmistakable calm. "You're Inspector Moreau?" she said softly. It was not a question. "I am." She nodded once. "Then you should know. The letters are not the whole truth. He wrote too. But his were never sent." Her voice faltered on the last word. Before he could speak, she turned toward the door, her coat brushing against the radiator, releasing a faint scent of violets. And then she was gone into the rain. Moreau stood motionless, the yellow glove warm in his palm. Somewhere in his memory, a page turned. The letters had begun to speak, but they were not finished yet. There were other voices, Émile's perhaps, or the city's, waiting to be heard beneath the bridge where promises rot. The inspector returned to his desk, the glove beside the letters, and stared at the blue ribbon binding them. There were too many coincidences, too much patience. Someone was orchestrating this, not to deceive him, but to draw him towards something older than guilt. As the last of the daylight vanished from the Seine, he whispered the names aloud, Adrienne, Émile, as if the sound itself might coax them back into flesh. For the first time in many years he felt the weight of other people's love pressing against his chest, heavier than any crime he had ever solved, and from somewhere in the dark city beyond his window, a voice, faint, feminine, and uncertain, seemed to answer, "You are not late, Inspector, only just in time." The path to the widow's house followed the river as if the water itself had written it, a thin ribbon of mud and cinder that kept close to the current's shoulder. Rouen's mist had pulled itself low again, veiling the opposite bank so that houses appeared and retreated like indecisive thoughts. Inspector Moreau walked without hurry, his coat pulled tight, the letters bound in blue ribbon pressing a faint square against his breast pocket. A trolley clanged somewhere inland, and from a moored barge came the slow scrape of a broom against deckboards. The air had that cold, clean taste of soaked stone, and beneath it a second flavour, iron, old wood, and the faintest memory of violets crushed in winter hands. The widow's house stood where the river narrowed and sprang forward again, a long, pale building with shuttered eyes and a small garden left in the care of absence. A willow dragged the ends of its hair in the water. The gate was unlatched. Moreau lifted it gently and let it close itself behind him with a click that sounded like the end of a sentence. He knocked once and waited, listening to the slow approach of steps across bare boards. She opened the door without asking who stood there. A slight woman, wrapped in a shawl too large for her, the plainness of her dress made dignified by the care with which it was worn. Silver threaded the dark of her hair in deliberate lines. Her eyes were the grey of spent fog and steadier than he expected. "You've come about the old case," she said, and even the way she said old made the years stand at attention. "Madame Lefebvre?" he asked. She inclined her head. "Armand's widow, yes. Come in. The river makes guests linger if they are not quickly taken from it." He stepped into a room arranged as if it had been expecting him for weeks. A table, set near the window, 2 chairs, a kerosene lamp whose glass was clean enough to show its purpose, a tray with a pot and 2 cups. On the mantel, photographs in oval frames watched, with the imprecision of memory. A young officer in dress uniform, a woman with a parasol under a summer hat, a group of men at a retirement dinner beneath bunting that had yellowed even in its image. "Tea," she said, pouring. "I cannot offer coffee. The smell makes the house remember too much." Moreau warmed his hands around the cup and did not drink. "You sent the letters," he said, not as an accusation, but as a kindness, relieving her of the labor of introducing her courage. She lifted her eyes to his, held them there, and then nodded. "They were in a box my husband called his unfinished drawer. After he died, I set the keys aside. A month ago I opened it." Her gaze drifted to the willow outside, its branches tracing the water. "The blue ribbon was enough. I knew it would find its way to you, Inspector, or to someone who still hears how a case speaks when one tries to teach it silence." "Why now?" Moreau asked. "Because the man returned," she said simply. "We think we locked the door on a particular year, but the door only learns to open from the other side." He placed the small key from Émile Durand's pocket on the table between them. The blue ribbon looked like an old vein. Her eyes followed the object with something like recognition, and not surprise. "My husband had a phrase for that," she said. He would say, "The key to a lie is small and tied as if to a child's wrist." He liked sentences that sounded wiser than he felt. I suppose all men in his position did. 304B, Moreau said softly, watching the river's light moving in her pupils. The file withdrawn. Adrienne Duhamel. Vanished. "Withdrawn," she repeated, as one repeats the word people prefer because it spares them from a truer one. Armand believed he was keeping the city whole. He told himself that the truth would only make grief choose a second victim. "What did he remove?" Moreau asked. "Only the letters?" She set down her cup, her fingers resting on the saucer's rim as if it could steady the past. A photograph, a telegram, a handwritten confession that never learned how to end. She glanced at the photographs on the mantel, and then away again. Do not make him a villain. He was vain, yes. He liked the way justice looked in the mirror. But he was also fond of mercy when mercy would hold still long enough to be admired. "Show me," Moreau said, and the words sounded to him like a prayer. She rose and crossed to a cabinet whose lock was newer than the wood that held it, pressing a key into its lip with the certainty of long practice. From inside, she brought a tin box, the kind that once held biscuits, its lid dented by years of being placed down more gently than necessary. She set it between them and lifted it open. Inside lay the careful clutter of a life never properly put away. The telegram that had been spoken of, its paper brittle, its type scabbed with age. A folded photograph with a crease that had grown white from worry. A sheet of paper covered in dense, nervous script. He took up the telegram first, reading it in the voice he had come to recognize, the voice that refuses to wear a signature. "Do not look for her in Rouen. She is nearer than your courage." The date bore the spring of 1919. The place stamp was Paris, Quai des Orfèvres. The clerk's initials at the corner were not Adrienne's, not Emile's. A third hand. "Armand received that," she said. "He did not tell his men. He put it in the drawer and went home as if nothing under his coat burned." Moreau unfolded the photograph, with the reverence one learns only in rooms like this. A young woman at the edge of a river, not the Seine here, but a cousin of it, stood with her face turned away, as if the camera had said her name and she had decided not to answer. The brim of her hat made a thin shadow across her cheek. In her hand, unmistakable, a small cluster of violets. Beside her was a man half out of frame, his shoulder only, and the suggestion of a watch chain. On the back, a line in pencil. "Forgive me for the angle. I could not bear to ask you to face me." The signature was an E and a flourish. Emile had always tried to make his sorrow beautiful, and had failed only in the part where it might have mattered. He set the photograph down and lifted the confession. The paper had known water at some point. The ink had crowded into lozenges and then retreated. He read, "I did not intend absence. Absence instructed me. The winter after the armistice made a coward of me where the war had not. I feared that my return would show her the arithmetic of what I had lost. I thought then that distance was a kind of gift. Forgiveness is mathematically impossible. It refuses the sum. If Adrienne is to be saved, it must be from me. If she disappears, it will be mercy I put in motion. Let the city accuse me of having loved badly. I will accept the charge." The line broke and resumed lower, smaller. "I bought the yellow gloves because they were not hers. I believed that if I carried the proof of my misfit, she would be spared the temptation to adjust to me. This is a confession without a crime. The only body is time." Moreau felt the quiver beneath the surface of the words. A man arguing with himself as one argues with a fever, refusing the truth because it would require a different life to admit it. He looked up. "Where did Adrienne go?" he asked, and did not expect the simple answer. The widow's smile touched one corner of her mouth and then evaporated. "Do not scold me with that question, Inspector. I did not keep the city's secrets. I lived with them. But I can tell you what I was told, which is not the same thing as telling you what is true." Armand returned late the night after that telegram. He took off his boots quietly, so as not to wake me, forgetting that quietness wakes a wife as surely as a slammed door sleeps her. He said only this: "She is not in Rouen. Someone brave will have to find her in Paris." "Paris is not small," Moreau said. "No," she agreed, "but the bridges teach us where people hide. The ones who do not want to be named live beneath what everyone else admires." Her eyes went to the willow again. "You have received notes, I think. Someone who knows how to speak to you without lowering a veil." Moreau touched the telegram in his pocket with 2 fingers. "Look beneath the bridge where promises rot." The voice had crossed years without learning to falter. "Did your husband know who wrote them?" he asked. He pretended not to. That was one of his specialties. She paused, looking at her hands as if they had once held something better. "A girl came to this house in the spring of 19. She wore a brown coat that had learned to be brave. She smelled of soap and cheap starch, and, beneath it, violets. She asked for my husband by his title, not his name. I brought her tea and watched her choose not to drink it. She did not remove her hat." He felt the chair under him grow sharp. "Adrienne." "It could have been," she said. "It could also have been the girl a city invents when it wants to assign a face to an ache." She glanced at the mantel, where the officer in dress uniform had begun to look like every officer who had ever believed he was needed. She asked if a man could be forgiven for hesitating at a station. Armand told her that stations are museums of hesitation. She smiled, and I learned that some smiles are made of fabric. They fold and put away politely. What did she ask him to do? To stop looking, I think, or to look differently, or perhaps to return certain letters to a drawer and let a different narrative walk out into the street. You see why I cannot be precise. And the girl, he said slowly, what name did she give the maid when she arrived? None, the widow said. But when she left, she forgot her handkerchief on the chair. There were initials in the corner, sewn in white, that had yellowed, A.D. She folded her shawl tighter. I kept it until last week. Then I took it to the laundry by the cathedral, the one that has changed names but not its steam, and I left it there with the money for cleaning. I thought, if it can find its way back, there is still a system in this world I understand. The river outside shifted its shoulder. Somewhere upriver, a barge's horn gave a single, doubtful note, as if asking permission, from the fog. Your husband closed the case, Moreau said, and told himself he was choosing mercy. Yes, she said, but mercy is accustomed to particular addresses. It prefers one person at a time. The rest call it conspiracy. He rose, the tin box's shadows cooling the tabletop. I will return the letters when I am done with them. You will do as the case instructs you, she answered, a tired music in the sentence. As of this morning, the case no longer speaks to me. It speaks to you. It has your voice now. Do not let it say something you will not wish to hear. He left her at the door, the willow making its slow curtsies to the current. The river took back the footpath as if it were not done with it yet, and he walked in the narrow place that remained, the city to his left, the water to his right, and in his coat the weight of a photograph that had decided to be heavier than paper. At the bridge he paused. People crossed as if bridges were simply an extension of streets, and not the narrow theatres where choices are performed without witnesses. In the underside of the arch, darkening from damp, names had been carved by boys who had wanted proof of their existence to live where the sun did not interrogate it. A bouquet, violets, too early, too eager, had been tucked into the joints of stone, their purple daring the grey to admit colour. He reached up and touched one petal with a knuckle. It left no stain, only a slight scent like a past tense. He did not see the figure until it had already drifted from the pillar's shadow. A woman in a dark coat, hat brim low, gloveless hands pale against the railing. She did not look at him. She looked down where the water folded and refolded itself as if rehearsing a confession. When she moved, it was not to flee. It was the movement of someone remembering how to walk away from a place without turning her back on it. Something fell from her pocket. Not by accident. It had the deliberation of a message. A matchbox from a café at the foot of Pont de la Tournelle. Then she was on the steps and up into the light, and in the light she became a citizen again, and citizens are notoriously difficult to follow without introducing one's intentions. Moreau picked up the matchbox and felt inside with the caution one reserves for insects and memories. There was no match, only a folded strip of paper cut from the margin of a ledger. On it, in the same peppery type he had come to know, the words, "You are nearer than your fear. She is learning to forgive the wrong city." He pocketed the message and looked along the river toward Paris, which at that moment seemed both inevitable and far. The bridge arched above him with the unanswerable logic of stone, and the current made its patient argument for motion. By the time he reached the station, the afternoon had turned toward the color that lamps choose for themselves when they want to be useful rather than admired. He bought his ticket without speaking the name of the city aloud, as if the clerk might hear Paris and decide to warn someone waiting beneath a different bridge. In the compartment, alone with the river's smell prowling his coat, he unfolded the confession again and read the line he had missed the first time because he had not yet earned it. If she is alive, she is no longer the person who knew me. I have returned only to prove that I can leave again under her terms. The handwriting had faltered there and recovered. The pen lifted, dipped, continued. A man, practicing exit. The train gave a slow shudder and accepted its task. Fields opened, closed, opened again. Villages stood with their shutters half-lidded like animals, deciding whether to sleep. Moreau watched the landscape receive its evening and counted the bridges in the window's reflection the way one counts an argument's points. At each, he tested a different way of saying forgiveness to himself and found none that satisfied the river in him. When the train slid into Gare du Nord, night had stepped forward fully onto the stage. He walked out into the city that had put him in uniform and taught him to wear its secrets. The air smelled of rain and the ink of evening papers. Beneath his coat, the letters kept the temperature of a hand. He knew where he was going even before his feet admitted it, down toward the water, where promises rot, and where sometimes, unwillingly, unhandsomely, something like absolution survives the weather that tries to make it dissolve. The next morning arrived pale and soundless, the kind of grey that seemed to press against the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres like a silent witness. Inspector Moreau sat at his desk, his coat still damp from the journey, his eyes fixed on the pile of papers that refused to explain themselves. The case had grown into a living thing now, breathing softly, rearranging its own bones when he wasn't looking. Every fact carried its own contradiction, every silence began to sound like intent. He poured coffee that had cooled too quickly, lit his pipe, and read through his notes again. Émile Durand, Adrienne Duhamel, the widow, the letters, the gloves, the bridges. A series of names and objects, all leading back to a single absence, a truth that refused to present itself. He knew that feeling too well. There had been other investigations that ended not in triumph, but in surrender, the evidence intact, the soul of the thing gone missing. Yet this one clung to him differently. It did not beg to be solved, it wanted to be understood. Janvier entered quietly, holding a thin folder. "You should see this," he said. Lucas found it in the records room, misfiled under property claims. Moreau took the folder, the edges soft with age. Inside was a police memorandum dated 1919, signed by Chief Inspector Armand Lefebvre. It described a woman found near the Pont de la Tournelle, alive but incoherent, claiming to have lost her memory after falling from a carriage into the river. No name, no papers, only a description that made the back of Moreau's neck tighten. Blonde hair, small hands, faint scar on the right wrist. She had been sent to Sainte Marguerite Hospice for recovery. Why wasn't this in the case file? Moreau asked. Janvier hesitated. Because Lefebvre ordered it sealed. He called it a matter of public discretion. Moreau's voice dropped. He saved her. Or hid her, Janvier said. It depends on who was watching. The inspector leaned back, letting the pipe's smoke form its own thinking above him. Adrienne had survived. Or someone had wanted it to seem that way. He imagined her sitting by a hospital window, watching the city that had swallowed her whole. He imagined Lefebvre, the man whose portrait still smiled from the hallway, deciding which version of mercy best suited his conscience. Moreau stood and took his coat. Sainte Marguerite, tell Lucas to meet me there. The hospice stood beyond the outer boulevards where Paris surrendered to open sky. It was built, like all charitable institutions of the era, grey stone, iron gates, a promise of redemption expressed in architecture. Inside, the corridors smelled of bleach and lilac soap. A nun guided him to a small office lined with patient ledgers. The bindings faded to the same dust colour as the walls. "I'm looking for a woman admitted in May 1919, he said. "Unidentified, possibly found near the river." The nun ran her fingers along the spines, stopping when the year matched. She lifted a heavy volume to the desk and opened it. Her finger paused on a line. "Yes. Entry 47B. Female, approximately 26, brought by police. No name. Discharged to private care 6 weeks later." Private care? Moreau asked. She nodded. A gentleman arranged it, said he was family. His name? She squinted at the faded ink. It was written here once, then crossed out. But the pen left a groove. You can still see the shape. Moreau bent close, tracing the indentation with his fingertip. It was unmistakable. The first letter, L, then the faint curve of E and F, Lefebvre. Outside, the wind stirred the dry leaves along the courtyard wall. For the first time, Moreau felt the weight of something heavier than guilt, the inheritance of another man's mercy. He returned to his car, Lucas waiting by the curb, and handed him the note. She was discharged into his care. He must have hidden her somewhere. Lucas frowned. To protect her? Or to protect himself, Moreau said. Either way, she lived. And if she lived, she might still be the one writing to me now. The thought lingered like a slow exhale. The telegrams, the letters, the woman by the bridge, all of them could be Adrienne, or all could be ghosts made from her absence. That night, Moreau returned home for the first time in 3 days. The apartment was quiet. Madame Moreau had left a pot of soup covered on the stove, a note beside it. You look for others too long, you forget who is already found. He smiled faintly, though the words struck deeper than she intended. He ate in silence, then sat in his chair by the window, listening to the rain return. In the reflection on the glass, he saw not his own face but Lefebvre's, the smiling portrait from the hall, the man whose mercy had rewritten an entire case. Moreau realized then that every inspector, no matter how honest, carried a moment when justice bent toward pity and called itself wisdom. He thought of Adrienne, of Emile, of the widow by the river who spoke of doors that opened from the other side. He thought of the telegram's promise, "You are nearer than your fear," and wondered if the sender watched him now, measuring his hesitation. At midnight, a knock sounded at the door. Moreau rose, half expecting Janvier, half expecting no one at all. But when he opened it, there was only an envelope on the floor. No footsteps, no messenger. He lifted it slowly. Inside lay a photograph, newly printed, glossy and sharp. It showed a woman sitting at a cafe table by the river, her face turned slightly away. The same hat, the same tilt of the chin. Unmistakably Adrienne. Only this was no relic from the past. The photograph was recent. On the back, a line of typed words, Saint-Cloud, Thursday, 3 o'clock. Moreau felt the tremor of decision gather within him. If she lived, she had chosen her moment. If this was a trap, it had been set with exquisite patience. Either way, he would go. The next day, Paris wore its spring disguise, the kind of false warmth that lures even the weary into hope. The café at Saint-Cloud overlooked the water, sunlight trembling on the tables like scattered coins. Moreau arrived early, the photograph in his pocket, his hat pulled low. The waiter recognized neither his name nor his purpose. He ordered coffee and waited. At 3 precisely, she came. A woman in her 40s now, composed, dressed simply, but with the care of someone who has learned how to vanish in plain sight. She carried gloves, yellow, folded neatly in one hand. When their eyes met, neither spoke. At last she said, "You look just like him." "Like who?" "Lefebvre," she said. "I thought you might. You ask questions the way he used to, like confessions you already know the ending to." "You're Adrienne." She smiled faintly. "Once. Names, Inspector, are like coats. You change them when the weather demands it." He leaned forward. "Why the letters? Why the telegrams? Why return now?" She set the gloves on the table between them, her fingers resting lightly on the edge. "Because he came back to die, and I could not let him do it without being seen. You think of death as punishment. Some of us think of it as a conversation that has waited too long to resume." Her eyes flicked to the river, where sunlight wavered like breath. He sent me one final letter, not the ones you've read, a single page, no greeting. It said only, "I will wear the gloves you could not forgive, and wait where the city still believes in endings." "Montmartre," Moreau said quietly. She nodded. "He wanted me to find him, but I arrived too late. That was mercy too." Moreau looked at her, at the calm, the exhaustion, the strange dignity of someone who had lived too long in silence. "And the telegrams?" "I sent them," she said. "At first to warn you, then to guide you. You needed to see what mercy costs." He exhaled slowly. "And what will you do now?" She smiled with that quiet sadness Paris teaches its survivors. "Now, I will walk by the river until it stops asking for his name." She rose, left the gloves on the table, and walked into the sunlight. Moreau did not follow. Some ghosts require distance to stay human. He sat there until the coffee cooled, watching the current carry her reflection downstream. By the time he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the city had darkened again. In his office, the portrait of Lefebvre seemed to have changed expression, not guilt, not pride, but fatigue. Moreau poured himself a glass of cognac and whispered, "We all close the wrong cases, don't we?" Outside, rain began again, soft, deliberate, endless. He thought of Adrienne's final words, of Émile's confession, of Lefebvre's mercy. Somewhere beneath the bridges of Paris, promises continued to rot, but they also bloomed, quietly, in the dark. And for the first time in years, Inspector Moreau allowed himself to doubt not the crime, but the justice that followed it. By morning, the case had exchanged its coat. What had moved through corridors and along river paths in a hush now walked the boulevards speaking in a dozen borrowed voices. The kiosks wore it like a carnival mask. Headline cards leaned on wooden slats like small billboards of certainty. The gloved ghost of Montmartre, widow's secret files, chief inspector's vanishing angel. The city had discovered its appetite again. Paris always did. Newsprint inked the fingers of bakers, tram conductors, seamstresses on their way to work, and the story, no longer his, began to acquire a posture that did not resemble anything Inspector Moreau recognized. The air outside the Quai des Orfèvres smelled of wet paper and roasted chestnuts. The scent mixed with the river's breath and made a taste like gossip left to cool. Inside, the switchboard crackled as if it were catching fire with names. Lucas closed his office door against the telephone's insistence. Janvier arrived with a sheaf of newspapers tied in twine, the knot hurried and apologetic. He spread them on Moreau's desk without a word. Photographs glared up. A stairwell in Montmartre with a shadow helpfully labelled "Where He Fell," a blurred image of a café terrace at Saint-Cloud supposedly showing The Woman Who Forgave, a portrait of Lefebvre taken 20 years earlier and now pressed into service as either a saint's icon or a wanted poster, depending on the column. Somewhere in the mess, a small paragraph quoted an unnamed source at the prefecture, declaring that the present investigation had gone personal. The sentence left a bruise. Moreau lit his pipe and read in silence. The worst pieces were not the ones that lied openly. It was the careful articles that did the most damage, those that spoke in the sober tone of facts but allowed rumour to enter through the grammar, like a draught through a well-fitted window. He found himself reading the same sentences twice, as if repetition could summon a different conclusion. In one account, Adrienne had drowned and returned as a figure of urban legend. In another, she had married a banker and lived under a new name in Neuilly. A third speculated that she had been kept in a police safe house, a phrase that made tenderness sound like theft. "Where are they getting this?" Lucas asked, his voice flat with the fatigue of a man who had seen too many truths become novelties. "From us," Moreau said, surprising himself with the bluntness. "From the silences we leave, the doors we close, the files we allow to remain misfiled. The city will always draft its own report when we refuse to write one it can bear to read." A knock. The duty sergeant stepped in and tilted his head toward the corridor. "A monsieur from Le Courrier du Soir to see you, Inspector. He says he has something you have lost." Moreau considered refusing. Then he nodded. The journalist entered with the cautious swagger of a man who has been lied to often enough to mistake brutality for truth. He was 30, perhaps, thin, with a tie that had learned to be ironed by hand. He introduced himself as Roussel, placed his hat carefully on the radiator, and withdrew from his coat an envelope the color of dirty cream. He did not hand it over at once. He examined the room, the lamp, the portrait of Lefebvre, the ashtray that chronicled sleeplessness, and then gave the envelope to Moreau with both hands, as if it contained a relic. "Where did you get this?" Moreau asked. "In the post," Roussel said. "Addressed to me, though I believe it was meant for you. That happens when the city wishes to test whether it can trust its own heart." He sat without being invited. "It contains a carbon copy of a memorandum from 1919, a directive to remove a woman from public record and conceal her whereabouts under the pretext of medical discretion. It bears the initial L." "Lefebvre," Moreau said, because the journalist was waiting to hear it pronounced by someone who might still claim authority over the word. Roussel nodded. "And something else. A line written in the margin, in a different hand, the ink browned unevenly, like tea left too long on the stove. Do not open the drawer until the river asks." "You have drawers full of such sentences, I imagine?" "Fewer than you think," Moreau said, but the remark felt tired and private. Roussel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and pitched his voice lower, as if the walls might be taking notes. "Inspector, I do not enjoy inventing. It takes too much energy that could be spent on solace. Tell me where the woman is, and I will tell the city something quieter than the story it wants." "She is where the city does not get to go," Moreau said, and immediately regretted the turn of phrase. It sounded like the arrogance he had spent his life trying not to wear. The journalist's eyes darkened, not with triumph, but with a kind of pity. "Then the city will knock on every door. It will ask the baker's boy to remember what he delivered to the hospice in May 1919. It will find the glovemaker's invoice and make of it a map. It will make your doubt into an anecdote. We do this not because we are cruel, but because the absence of a story is a kind of terror for us." Moreau opened the envelope. The carbon was faint but legible. The directive from Lefebvre to the hospice, the bureaucratic language trying to wrap itself around a tender intention and failing. In the margin, indeed, the small, untidy sentence, "Do not open the drawer until the river asks." He held the paper at an angle so that the light could enter the strokes. He had the sudden impression that he was reading the residue of speech, as if the words were a room after the people had left it. "What do you want, Roussel?" he asked. "A truth small enough to hold," the journalist said, surprised by the simplicity of his own answer. "Failing that, a name to protect?" Moreau's silence turned an inch in the air. He found, to his annoyance, that he liked this man. He stood, walked to the window, and watched a barge cleave the river, leaving a V-shaped wake that made the reflections of buildings wobble. Behind him, the room breathed with patience. He imagined, not for the first time, what the case would look like if he stepped out of it. Papers rearranging themselves, voices choosing other hosts, the city maintaining its conversation without him. At last he said, "A woman once fell into the river and learned to keep breathing. A man returned to give back the future he had borrowed. Another man built a drawer when the cupboard would have done. And I am here to learn whether mercy always ruins the evidence." Roussel leaned back as if he had been pushed. He put on his hat too quickly. "We will print tomorrow," he said. "If there is a bridge in this story, Inspector, give me the right one." When the door closed, Lucas whistled under his breath. "You could have told him anything," he said. "You chose poetry." "Poetry breaks less than prose when the city steps on it," Moreau said. He placed the carbon beside the other papers and felt the case swell another rib. Afternoon stretched thin and mean. Letters arrived in loops. A man claiming to be Durand's cousin and demanding burial rights. A shopkeeper from Rouen insisting that the inspector had ruined his trade with talk of ghosts. A priest who wrote that absolution was being maligned in the press and needed a defender more articulate than a police report. Each envelope carried a scent of its sender: glue, tobacco, umbrellas. Each asked for the same thing in a different key, a conclusion. Toward dusk the prefect called. His voice had the varnished calm that furniture acquires with years of polishing. He praised diligence, deplored theatrics, reminded Moreau that confidence in the institution was a ledger with numbers that could not be allowed to go red. "Close it carefully," he said. "Do not allow the river to stand trial. People become sentimental when water is questioned." When the line went dead, Moreau stood in the hollow sound that remains after power leaves a room. He put on his coat and hat and walked out with no destination, allowing the streets to choose for him. The city had secrets even from itself. He had learned to read its posture, like a physician reading a patient who refuses to be explicit. He crossed the Ile de la Cité, where tourists looked up as if history lived in eaves, and followed the quay until the arches of Pont de la Tournelle lifted like a rib cage over the darkening current. Beneath, the stone was damp and honest. The graffiti, boys' names, lovers' initials, political nouns that looked abandoned at their own rally, had blurred at the edges. Someone had tucked fresh violets into a crack where mortar had given up. The flowers were darker than the evening. He reached out and felt the cool of the petals with the back of his fingers, the way one touches a fevered brow. The river moved with its old, disinterested wisdom. He thought of Adrienne's face at Saint-Cloud, of the way her gaze had made room for him without inviting him to live there. Footsteps. A man descended the stairs with the caution of someone who had not yet learned whether he was expected. He stopped 2 paces away, hat in hand. "Inspector," he said, and his voice had the rasp of late nights and cheap cigarettes. "You don't know me. I sell papers at the kiosk by the hospice. 19 years ago, a gentleman paid me to deliver a bouquet, violets, to a woman who did not give her name. The gentleman came every Thursday for 6 weeks and then never again." "Describe him," Moreau said, though the description had already stood up in his mind and lifted a hand. "Tall, the kind of tall that knows it has been admired," the man said. "A neat beard, then. He smelled of soap you have to ask for by name. Once he slid a note into the ribbon. I did not read it. I was young and wanted to believe in rules." He hesitated, but the nurse on duty said the note had only 3 words. "Forgive me, anyway." The river made a sound like a chair moved carefully across a wooden floor. Moreau closed his eyes. He could see the corridor at Sainte-Marguerite, the bed by the window, the letters Adrienne never answered because her name had not yet been returned to her. "Why tell me now?" he asked. "Because the papers are making saints and villains," the man said. "I prefer people." Moreau gave him his thanks in coin and in the more expensive currency of attention. When the man left, the space he had occupied remained briefly in the air like a scent. Night had moved in entirely. The lamps drew timid halos on the wet stone. In their light, the river looked less like an absence and more like a patient. He climbed back to the street. The kiosks had begun to pack away their headlines, leaving only the next morning's blank slates. The city, exhausted by its own excitement, turned towards sleep. In his pocket, the newest telegram, the carbon, the memorandum, the old command to the drawer, pressed together like layers of a pastry that refused to be cut without collapsing. He felt suddenly, vividly, the presence of Lefebvre walking beside him, not as a ghost, but as a fact of his profession. A man who had once decided that a life must be kept rather than explained, and who had believed that his decision would remain private property. At home, Madame Moreau had left the lamp burning and the window cracked to let the river through. He sat and removed his shoes as quietly as the widow had described, and for a moment he was tempted to take his wife into the case to say Adrienne's name aloud in the room where they kept their ordinary. He did not. Instead, he told the story to the chair, to the pipe, to the silence, and the silence answered with the soft dignity of furniture that has heard too much. Near midnight, the telephone rang. The sound dived through the apartment and struck him like a thrown stone. He rose, crossed the room, and lifted the receiver. The line carried only breath at first, a woman's breath, controlled, choosing how much fear to spend. Then the voice came, steady as a lantern held against a wind. "You asked the journalist for the right bridge," she said. "Bring no one. Come now." "Which bridge?" "You already know," Adrienne said, and the line went empty, leaving only the river's small static between continents of quiet. Moreau stood with the receiver in his hand and felt the case take his weight more completely than it ever had before. He put on his coat. The night smelled of stone and decisions. He walked out without leaving a note, because some explanations weaken themselves when written, and because the city, at last, had decided to ask its own question out loud. He went toward the water, guided by the rule that had replaced all the others. When mercy has ruined the file, truth sometimes climbs out by way of confession. The arches ahead gathered darkness like a cloak. Under one of them, someone waited who had learned to speak only at the hour when rumour sleeps. The night had settled into its final draft, the kind of deep gloom that turned the Seine into a strip of ink spilling through the heart of Paris. Inspector Moreau walked along the embankment, his footsteps making no sound against the slick cobblestones. The air was sharp with mist, and the lamps cast their halos like tired thoughts, their glow bruised by the darkness between arches. Somewhere upriver, a tugboat sighed, the sound collapsing into silence almost before it reached his ears. He passed the Pont Marie, where once he and Janvier had waited for a suspect who never came, then Pont de Sully, its rails cold as reason. He kept moving until the shape of Pont de la Tournelle rose ahead. The same stone witness he had stood under days earlier, violet still tucked into its crevice like a signature that refused erasure. The river's breath clung to him, moist and insistent. He descended the worn steps, each one holding centuries of patience. Beneath the arch, a figure stood pressed against the shadow, neither hiding nor revealed. A woman wrapped in a dark coat, the brim of her hat dropped low, her gloveless, hands pale and still at her sides. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying both fatigue and focus, like someone who has long since chosen exhaustion over escape. "Adrienne," he replied, knowing that was not the name she lived by now, only the one her past would answer to. She stepped closer, the muted lamplight catching her face just enough to show the clarity of her features, the fine lines carved by years of restraint, the quiet control in her gaze. Time had not ravaged her, it had sculpted her, allowing sorrow to settle in places where vanity once dwelled. "You came alone," she observed. "You asked me to." "The others wouldn't understand," she said. Her eyes flicked toward the river, where the current curled around the bridge, piling as if thinking its own slow thoughts. They try to close the file with their silence. You're the first to hear the echo of it. She reached into her coat pocket and brought out a folded sheet of paper. It was creased in quarters, softened by fingers that had read it too often to be respectful. She held it out to him. "The last letter, the one he wrote to no one. I found it beneath the mattress of that room in Rouen, where he stayed before returning here." Moreau took it. The handwriting was unmistakably Émile's, cramped with hesitation, as though he feared the paper might judge him for being too precise or too tender. "If she is still alive," it began, "let her live without the stain of my deferral. If she is gone, let the river bear witness to what I lacked the courage to face. I have worn her absence long enough. Tonight I return to the city that wrote our ending without our consent. I will wear the yellow gloves she once refused, as a sign that I know how much of me was never hers to carry. The river knows the rest. The final line was darker, ink pooled at the letter's feet like shadow. I am not leaving to be mourned. I return to be forgiven for leaving. He never sent it, she said quietly. Perhaps because he understood that sending a confession is only another form of running. Moreau looked up, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. You arrived in Montmartre after he died. Adrienne's breath caught the lamplight and broke it like glass. Minutes after, too late to forgive him in person, too late for anything but presence. The inspector's voice carried no judgment. Why send the telegrams? Why guide me? Because you're the only one who understands what a case becomes when it outlives its dossier. You know that some stories need someone to witness them, not solve them. She paused, then added, You reminded me that my silence was not mercy. It was abandonment wearing grief's coat. She stepped closer to the arch's midpoint, where the river's hush coated the stone. Do you know what I remember most? Not the waiting, not the letters, the smell of violets. He chose them because they wilt quickly, and no one expects them to last, like promises made in wartime. From her coat pocket she withdrew a single violet, pressed flat, fragile as a sigh. This is the last one, the only one I kept. Everything else I let fall into the river. You want it to end? Moreau said. No, she said. I want it to be seen. Ending is only the city's way of turning away. I've done that already. I can't do it again. She placed the violet in his hand. Do you know what justice is, Inspector? She asked. It's not the punishment of a crime. It's the acknowledgement that someone suffered without needing to prove it. The river stirred like something listening. Moreau nodded. Then here, beneath this bridge, I acknowledge it. Not as evidence, as truth. Adrienne closed her eyes, and for a moment the years folded back, the lost telegrams, the stolen hope, the gloves too small for her hands. When she opened them again, the past returned to her, like a face lit by its own forgiveness. Thank you, she said. When this story is told, tell it softly. Not every wound needs to echo. She turned and walked up the steps, her silhouette threading itself between the lamps. No dramatic farewell, no flourish of a train ticket tucked into a page. She vanished into the ordinary life of someone who had chosen to be unremarkable once and for all. Inspector Moreau remained beneath the bridge, the violet curling in his palm like a final word. In the quiet, he imagined Lefebvre's portrait looking slightly to one side, unwilling to admit that mercy, too, can be mistaken. He imagined Émile's yellow gloves folded neatly over a dead heart, and understood that closure is only ever practiced, not perfected. The river reached its slow fingers toward the inspector's shoes. He looked up. Paris's bridges arched over him like the ribs of an immense, sleeping beast. People crossed them daily without asking what they carried overhead. Moreau walked back along the embankment, the violet still warm from her hand. The fog thickened near the Ile Saint-Louis. Boats moaned as they turned. In the distance, Notre Dame rose like a cathedral of unresolved prayers, its buttresses holding up not faith, but the scaffolding of persistence. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he returned to his office and sat before the portrait of Lefebvre. The smile seemed different now, less sure of its victory. He placed Adrienne's violet on the case file and wrote in the margin. He returned, not for absolution, but for her to know that he had learned how to carry his absence. He closed the file, not locked, not sealed, simply closed. In the window's reflection he saw not himself, but a bridge, ageless, stony, and patient, and beneath it, two figures who had finally reached the end of their waiting. He whispered to the river that could not hear him, "Let it be enough." Outside, the water carried the city's lights like confessions it was content to drown.